Good morning. My name is Wade. I preach over at the Preston Road Church of Christ across town. It's good to be with you. I think over the last 10 years, I have preached here probably around 10 times, and I have become, over the years, such a fan of this church. The things that you all are doing, the risks that you're taking, the space you're creating for people to come and hear the good news is inspiring to me. It's inspiring to our church over on Preston Road. And as best I can this morning as a way of introduction, I want to encourage you to keep going, to keep leading the way, to keep taking risks, to keep pressing forward. I want you to know that other churches are watching, and we're learning, and in some ways we're jealous of the many good things that God is bringing about here, the fruit that God is bringing to bear here in this church. So thank you. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this. Pat's already preached once over at Preston Road. He'll be preaching again. I love these days when we get to switch. He preaches twice. I only have to preach once. I told him it's because he needs the practice, so just get in an extra rep. I grew up in a church, I'm guessing like many of you, that didn't make much of Christmas, much less Advent. It just wasn't something we talked about, and even when I was a young preacher in my early to mid-20s, I didn't fully grasp the importance of Advent, this season where we prepare to celebrate the birth of Christ. And over the years, and maybe it's because I've had children of my own and I understand through their eyes how hard it is to wait, I've come to appreciate how important this season is. It trains us. It trains us to wait. It reminds us to hope. We prepare to celebrate Jesus' first coming. Of course we do, but Advent also invites us to pause and remember that as much good as Jesus has done in the world already, there's more coming. And we can celebrate his first coming, but we continue to wait for his second coming. And Advent is this time of year when we as the people of God, we get to learn how to wait well. And that's what these texts and these songs that we read and sing during Advent, that's what they do. They teach us how to wait well. And they sometimes show us what to do while we wait. And that's what this text does this morning that we're going to read. If you have your Bibles, turn to Isaiah chapter 2. We're going to read a text that is a prophetic vision of God's dream for the world. And it comes from Isaiah chapter 2, beginning in verse 1 all the way through verse 5. This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And he will judge between nations and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Come, descendants of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord." Isaiah looks beyond the failure and the unfaithfulness of the people of God, which he's already described in Isaiah chapter 1 and continues to describe in the remainder of chapter 2. You read those 2 chapters, and this little vision of hope is sandwiched between words of judgment. Descriptions of injustice. The people of God are not living out their calling. They're not walking in the light of the Lord. And Isaiah is able to look beyond all of that for just a few verses and envision a day when Israel's God will be worshiped. Not just by Israel, the descendants of Jacob, but by all the nations of the world. The mountain of the Lord, where the temple is, also known as Mount Zion in Jerusalem, it will be elevated. Not topographically. There are other mountains and hills in that region that are higher and taller than Mount Zion. But theologically, it will be elevated. It will become the center of the world. And all the nations of the earth will stream to it. Now, normally, streams flow away from mountains. But in this vision, the flow is reversed, and now the peoples of the world will stream toward the mountain of the Lord. And they'll come not just to worship, but also to learn, to be instructed in the way of the Lord, to gain wisdom and insight to guide their paths. And from the mountain of the Lord, God's justice will be established. God will make all things right that are wrong. All the things Isaiah has been describing in chapter 1 and then in the rest of chapter 2, God will make all of those wrongs right. And he says God will settle disputes among the nations. God's wisdom will make war unnecessary. God's peace will render weapons obsolete. They'll take their swords and they'll beat them into plowshares. They'll take their spears and they'll turn them into pruning hooks. They'll take their weapons of destruction and turn them into tools of cultivation. Gun manufacturers will convert all the machinery in their factories to make tools rather than weapons. Isaiah envisions a day when all the nations of the world will shut down their military academies and fold up their boot camps because there will be no need to train for or learn war anymore. I recently read about this prophetic piece of art that an artist in Buenos Aires, Argentina made. It's a mobile library, but he formed it in the shape of a tank. Can you imagine? You see from afar this tank rolling through your neighborhood, coming down your street. What is that? It's a tank. And then this tank stops in front of your house, and out gets the driver who begins to pass out books. And he says, I'll give you as many books as you want as long as you promise to read them. He calls this his weapon of mass instruction. And just as this prophetic work of art can bring a smile to our face, Isaiah's prophetic vision is meant to make our heart beat faster and to make us smile longingly for what he describes. It is a time of deep peace. Not the absence of conflict. More than that, it's the creation of harmony between people who have been at odds with each other. This is God's shalom. It's that deep peace where all of creation fits together and functions exactly as it is created to do. This is what it will be like when God's justice breaks forth from the mountain of the Lord. During the season of Advent, can we hear these words from Isaiah? And can we look beyond our failure and unfaithfulness as the people of God? Can we look beyond our sin and the sin of our enemies, the sin of our opponents? Can we look beyond the anger and the hate and the violence that fills our news feed? And can we once again imagine a world that couldn't be more unlike the one in which we currently live? With apologies to John Lennon. Imagine. Imagine a world where there's peace in the Middle East. Imagine a world where people of different races and different classes and different religions and different political ideologies are one. Imagine a world where there are no more terrorist attacks, no more random explosions, no more kidnappings and torture and beheadings. Imagine a world where there are no dictators or tyrants, no more invasions, no more saber rattling. Imagine a world where there are no more sex slaves, no more sex trafficking, no more drug dealers, no more mass shootings at schools or public places. Imagine a world where no one lives in fear of physical or psychological violence. A world where violence as a strategy, as a habit, where war as a way of life have no future. Shalom, deep peace. Can you imagine living in that kind of world? Again, with apologies to John Lennon, I can't. No matter how hard I try, I just can't do it. I can hope for that kind of peace. I can long to live in that kind of world. But when you ask me, can you imagine yourself? Can you imagine others living in that kind of world? I can't do it. Maybe my imagination has been so twisted and distorted by stories of violence, movies and books and news reports, tragedies and broken hearts. Maybe I just can't get there anymore. It seems so far away. Isaiah's vision seems so unrealistic. But that's why we need Advent. That's why historically Christians all over the world come back and read texts like this every few years. Because at a time when some of us are stumbling, maybe staggering toward Christmas, struggling to fight back cynicism and despair and disillusionment, we need a word of hope today more than ever. We need a word of peace now more than ever, but not empty promise, pie in the sky, fairy tale fantasy hope. We need some hope that's rooted in reality, that we could actually see breaking out in this world. And today, for me, maybe not you, but for me, Isaiah's vision of peace isn't enough. I need more than poetry. I need, as a follower of Christ, to remember how Jesus came and took the baton from Isaiah and began to flesh out this vision in the real world. He reversed the geography of it. He declared himself to be the true temple of God. Not a building on a mountain in Jerusalem. Himself. He will now be the center, not of just the world, but of the entire universe. He's where heaven and earth come together in one spot. And rather than wait for all the nations of the world to come to Jerusalem to receive God's wisdom, Jesus comes first to his people to make disciples, and then he sends his disciples out to the nations. We won't wait for them to come to us. He says, we're going to go to them. Go to the nations and teach them what I have taught you. Show them what I have shown you. How to lay down your weapons and pick up your crosses and embrace the way of peace. And start living as if Isaiah's vision of the future is already coming true, not in the next world, but in this one. Because the shocking reality of the gospel is that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, God's future is already here. Theologians like to use the language of inbreaking, that God's future is breaking into the present. It's this rupture, it's this interruption, it's this surprise. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, the gospel, it's a message from God's future. That Isaiah's vision isn't an empty campaign promise from God. It isn't a fairy tale or a fantasy. It isn't just nice words and pretty imagery. Jesus' first coming is God's huge down payment on his promise to make all things new. And to overcome violence and war with peace, and sin and death and evil with life, with shalom. God's future in Jesus is already here. And rather than spend our time waiting, comparing Isaiah's vision of the future with how different it is from the way our world is now and getting discouraged, rather than just passively waiting, doing nothing, expecting God to show up again and do the impossible, the gospel actually equips us, shows us how to start living as if the future is already here. It shows us how to let Isaiah's vision of the future, God's dream for the world, shape how we live in the here and now. In verse 5 of chapter 2, this is what Isaiah calls out to the people of God. After giving this wonderful vision of peace in the future, God's shalom, he says, "Now come, descendants of Jacob. Let us walk in the light of the Lord." Come. Come on, people of God. Come on. If all the nations of the world are someday going to walk in the light of the Lord, let's go first. Let's start now. It may seem a long way off. It may seem like a dream. It may seem unrealistic. Let's go first. And how much more does the resurrection of Jesus energize and breathe new life into this call? Because somebody had to go first. Imagine all the nations of the world, they gather around Jesus. They all circle up, this huge huddle, and they've all brought their weapons. They've got their swords and their knives and their guns and their grenades and their bombs, their missiles. And they've all brought them together to this summit. And as Jesus is teaching his way of life, as he's delivering the wisdom of the Lord, they're listening to Jesus, but they're watching each other. Watching, keeping an eye on their enemies. And they hear the word of the Lord. And the word of the Lord from Jesus to them is this. He invites all the nations of the world, lay down your weapons. And no one moves. They just look at each other. Who's going to go first? Lay down your weapons, Jesus says. And no one among the nations has the courage, the faith, the willingness to take a risk and to lay down their weapons first. They just look at each other. And finally, Jesus says, okay, I'll go first. And he takes up the cross. And he says, this is how I will overcome evil. Not with a sword, not with a gun, not with an army, but with self-giving, sacrificial love. Jesus went first. And then he calls anyone who would follow him to lay down their weapons and take up their crosses and embrace his way of peace. Jesus' resurrection was a sign to his disciples that they really could trust God, that God really was going to keep his promises. But then our faithfulness to the way of Christ is a sign to the watching world that God's future really is taking root in this world. It's not a fairy tale. It's not a fantasy. Anything is possible. Because when we take this teaching from Jesus and we take this vision from Isaiah seriously and we begin to live it out, it can actually function as evidence to outsiders, skeptical outsiders, and cynical insiders that God's vision for the future is not as far off, it's not as unrealistic as we may think. This vision from Isaiah 2 actually played a prominent role in debates between skeptical Jews and early church fathers. The skeptics would argue, they knew their scriptures, and the skeptics made this argument. They said, there is no way that Jesus can be the Messiah. There is no way that he's been raised from the dead. There is no way that he could be the promised one. And you know how we know this is true? Because Isaiah 2 hasn't been fulfilled. What has Jesus done in the world, they would say? Nations are still at war with each other. There is not deep peace. God's shalom is not draped across creation. How has the world really changed in response to Jesus' alleged resurrection, they said. And one of the ways the early church fathers responded to that argument, to that critique from skeptical outsiders, was to say, actually, Isaiah 2 has been fulfilled, at least partially. It's been fulfilled in the church. You can see evidence of the way of peace in Jesus' followers. Here's how one early church father, Justin, described it. He said, for we Christians, he said this 1,800 years ago. He said, for we Christians who have gained a knowledge of the worship of God from the law and from the word which went forth from Jerusalem by way of the apostles of Jesus, have run for protection to the God of Jacob and the God of Israel. He's writing this, of course, as a non-Jew, as a Gentile. He says, and we who delighted in war, in the slaughter of one another, and in every other kind of iniquity, have in every part of the world converted our weapons of war into implements of peace, our swords into plowshares, our spears into farmers' tools, and we cultivate now piety, justice, brotherly charity, faith, and hope, which we derive from the Father through the crucified Savior. And then another church father, Tertullian, he backs this argument up with a shorter statement. He quotes Isaiah 2 and he says, and they shall join to beat their swords into plows and their lances into sickles, and nations shall not take up sword against nation, and they shall no more learn to fight. And then he asks, who else, therefore, are understood but we who fully taught by the new law observe these practices? And then finally, from Origen, he says, no longer do we take the sword against any nation, nor do we learn war anymore, since we have become sons of peace through Jesus. Oh, such a stunning statement. They say the world has changed. The world is changing. The world is going to change. And how do you know that's true? They could boldly say, look at us. Look at the church. Look at the way followers of Jesus have laid down their weapons and taken up their crosses and embraced the way of peace. There's your evidence that God's future is already present in this world. And maybe one of the reasons this image from Isaiah and these kind of texts meant to inspire hope, maybe the reason they seem so unrealistic to people like me and maybe you, maybe the reason that hope seems so far off is because there aren't enough followers of Jesus taking this image of peace seriously. Because somewhere over the last 2,000 years, we've lost the plot. We've lost touch with the heart of Jesus' teachings of how God will overcome evil in the world. And again, this is why we need Advent. This is why we need to come back and read these texts and be stunned by the hope they declare and be challenged by the way Jesus makes them come to life, because we forget. We do lose touch. We wander off. We drift. We become overwhelmed with the seeming impossibility of it all. And we need to remember. A couple of years ago, Jose Sakaloff did a TED Talk in which he described how he used his skills as a marketer to invite young soldiers fighting a guerrilla war in the Colombian jungles to lay down their guns and come home. And this is how he and his team did it. They went into the jungle and they put up Christmas lights on different trees. And they hoped that as these soldiers were walking through the jungle, they would see the Christmas lights in the jungle. And they would come to the trees and they would see this message next to the lights. If Christmas can come to the jungle, you can come home. Demobilize. In other words, lay down your guns and get out of this war. Demobilize. Anything is possible at Christmas. And several hundred young soldiers saw the Christmas lights in the jungles, read the message, laid down their weapons, and went home. Wasn't enough to end the conflict, but even just a few people taking a message seriously can be a sign of hope. Did you hear that? All it takes is just a few people to take a message, to take a vision, to take a dream seriously, to be a sign of hope. At a time for many of us when hope seems so far away, when deep peace seems like a fairy tale, can we hear these words again from Isaiah, filtered through the actions of Jesus? And can we hear the voice of God inviting us to come home? To come back to the heart of God and sit at the feet of Jesus and let him teach us the way of peace so that we can be living examples of what it looks like to walk in the light of the Lord. Can we hear that invitation this morning? If Christmas can come to the jungle, if God can come to us rather than waiting for us to go to him so that he can teach us, if Christmas can come to the jungle, if God can come to us, anything is possible. Come, descendants of Jacob. Come on, followers of Jesus. Let us walk in the light of the Lord.